At 60 years old, I thought betrayal would come from strangers, not from the woman I married and the man who handled my will. My wife didn't just cheat on me, she did it with my own lawyer, the man who knew every detail of my finances, my assets, and my future. What I uncovered wasn't just an affair, it was a legal strategy. If you believe trust can't be weaponized, stay with me. And if stories about loyalty, power, and quiet manipulation matter to you, make sure you follow along. Because what happened next changed the way I see everything. My name is Thomas Mercer. I turned 62 months before everything began to unravel. I had retired early, not because I was tired of working, but because I had worked hard enough to choose not to. I built a regional logistics company from scratch in my 30s. Sold it in my late 50s. Invested carefully. Structured everything conservatively. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't reckless, I believed in security. My wife, Linda, and I had been married for 33 years. We weren't dramatic people. No screaming matches. No slammed doors. We had settled into something stable. Predictable. Calm. Some people call that boring, I called it safe. Our house was paid off. Retirement accounts diversified. A trust in place for our 2 adult children. Estate planning updated every few years, which is how David Collins entered our lives. David was recommended by a former business partner. Mid-40s. Impeccable reputation. Specialized in estate structuring and asset protection for high-net-worth retirees. Calm voice. Measured tone. Expensive but worth it. The first time he came to the house, Linda was immediately impressed. He's sharp, she said after he left. You need someone like that handling things now. I agreed. David had a way of speaking that made complexity feel manageable. He didn't rush explanations. He didn't oversell. He made you feel like every decision was thoughtful. He began handling our trust updates, tax optimization strategies, and eventual transfer planning. He knew everything: our accounts, property holdings, insurance policies, beneficiary structures. I gave him full transparency. That's what you do with your lawyer. Looking back, I realize how complete that transparency was. Too complete. At first, his visits were purely professional. Formal. Polished. Then they became more relaxed. Coffee at the kitchen table instead of just folders in the office. Occasional laughter. Linda asking more questions than she had before about financial strategy. I didn't think much of it, she had always trusted me to manage the big decisions. Now she seemed engaged. Interested. Curious about asset protection and structuring. I thought that was growth. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and heard Linda laughing, genuinely laughing, at something David had said. It struck me because that kind of laughter had become rare between us. Not absent. Just less frequent. When they noticed me, the energy shifted slightly. Subtle. Not obvious. But enough that I registered it. What's so funny? I asked. Estate law horror stories, David replied smoothly. You'd be surprised what people do without proper planning. Linda shook her head, still smiling. You'd never let us be that careless, Thomas. I smiled back. No, I said. I wouldn't. At 60, you don't expect to be outmaneuvered inside your own home. The first real crack wasn't dramatic, it was paperwork. David sent over updated trust documents for review. I skimmed them, as I had dozens of times before. Most of it was familiar language. Distribution clauses. Tax efficiency revisions. Minor structural adjustments. I signed electronically, Linda signed too. It wasn't until a week later, when I was organizing files in my home office, that something felt off. There was a clause referencing expanded marital discretion in the event of temporary asset realignment due to domestic restructuring. The wording bothered me. Domestic restructuring, I didn't remember discussing that. I opened the full document and read more carefully. The clause allowed Linda, under certain conditions, to liquidate and reposition specific holdings without secondary authorization, provided the change aligned with estate preservation goals. Technically, it wasn't unreasonable, but it was broader than previous versions. I walked into the living room where Linda was reading. "Do you remember talking about this?" I asked, handing her the printed page. She scanned it briefly. "Oh, that. David mentioned it was standard language for flexibility. Especially at our age." "Our age?" She looked up. "Yes. In case something happens. Cognitive decline, health emergencies. You don't want bureaucracy delaying decisions." It sounded rational, logical, and yet, "I just don't remember approving expanded discretion," I said. She shrugged lightly. "You trust him, don't you?" I did. That was the point. That evening, I called David. He answered on the second ring. "Thomas. Everything clear?" "I noticed the restructuring clause," I said. "It's broader than before." There was a pause, not long, but measured. "Yes. We expanded spousal authority slightly. Purely protective. You never want rigidity in estate vehicles." I don't remember explicitly discussing that level of authority. "We touched on it during the last meeting," he said calmly. "You agreed flexibility was better than constraint." His tone was steady. Unthreatened. I felt almost embarrassed for questioning it. "I just want to be careful," I said. "And you should be," he replied. "That's why you hired me." The call ended smoothly, still. That night, I couldn't shake the discomfort. Not suspicion, just discomfort. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small shifts. Linda started attending more meetings with David. Previously, she'd let me handle the bulk of financial discussions. Now she asked pointed questions. What happens if assets need to be rebalanced quickly? How hard is it to dissolve certain holdings? What protections exist during marital disputes? That last one caught my attention, marital disputes. I asked later. She waved it off. General curiosity. You hear stories. I nodded. Stories. At 60, you assume your marriage has already survived its worst tests. Infidelity belongs to younger couples. Financial manipulation belongs to desperate ones. We were neither, at least, that's what I believed. One evening, as David packed his briefcase after another consultation, he placed his hand briefly on Linda's shoulder while making a point. It lasted maybe a second too long, not intimate, just familiar. When he left, I mentioned it casually. "You two seem comfortable," I said. Linda looked at me with mild surprise. "He's our lawyer, Thomas. Not a stranger." I nodded, but something had shifted. Not enough to accuse, not enough to confront, just enough to register. At 60, you don't expect danger from within your trusted circle, you expect time to be your enemy. Health to be your uncertainty. Markets to fluctuate, not the man who drafts your will, not the woman who signs it beside you. If there were warning signs, they weren't loud, they were quiet adjustments in tone. In language. In access, and I ignored them, because trust, when it's been earned over decades, feels immovable. It feels like bedrock. I didn't know then that bedrock can be reshaped, slowly, deliberately, by someone who understands the legal language well enough to move pieces without you noticing. The first time I felt true unease wasn't about money, it was about exclusion. David scheduled a quick clarification meeting while I was at the gym. Linda told me afterward, "Nothing major," she said. "Just reviewing some technical language." "You could have waited until I got back," I replied lightly. He was already nearby. That night, I opened my email and found a confirmation of document revision, time-stamped 2:11 p.m., signed electronically, by both of us. I stared at the digital signature. It was mine, but I didn't remember signing that specific version. That was the first moment I felt something deeper than discomfort, not panic, not anger, just the quiet realization that something in my life had moved. And I hadn't been fully present when it did, and at 60, that realization is more unsettling than betrayal itself, because it means you might not be as in control as you thought. And that's where this really begins. The older you get, the more you rely on pattern recognition. You know your spouse's rhythms. You know the cadence of their voice when they're distracted. You know when a conversation is neutral, and when it's layered, the revision timestamp sat in my inbox longer than it should have. 2:11 p.m., signed electronically. I was at the gym at 2:11 p.m., I remembered it clearly because I'd met an old colleague afterward for coffee. My phone had been in the locker. I opened the document again. The revision wasn't massive, that's what made it dangerous. Just subtle language tightening. A clause clarifying that in the event of marital reassessment, discretionary authority could be exercised unilaterally by the primary co-trustee, Linda. That designation hadn't existed in earlier drafts. I scrolled to the signature block. The digital authentication showed my email address, my IP location, my electronic signature, technically legitimate, except I had no memory of opening that file. I didn't confront Linda immediately. I didn't call David. At 60, you don't accuse without certainty. You investigate quietly. That evening at dinner, I watched Linda carefully. Not suspiciously. Just attentively. She was relaxed. Casual. Talking about a new cafe that had opened downtown. Asking if we should take a short trip in the fall. Nothing in her demeanor suggested urgency, nothing suggested deception, but absence of visible guilt is not proof of innocence. David seems busy lately, I said casually. She didn't hesitate. Estate planning season. Everyone restructuring before year-end. Restructuring, that word again. Did you sign anything new while I was out yesterday? I asked. She paused, not long enough to be dramatic, but long enough for me to notice. Just a minor revision. He said you were aware. I don't remember opening it. She frowned slightly, as if confused. You must have. It was sent to both of us. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was almost reassuring, and that unsettled me more than anger would have. After dinner, I went into my office and checked my email logs. The document had been accessed from my account, but the access timestamp didn't align with my usual login behavior. I'm not paranoid by nature. I'm methodical. I called the IT consultant who occasionally handled security for my old company. We'd stayed in touch. Hypothetically, I asked him, how difficult would it be for someone with physical access to a device to send and sign a document from another user's email? He didn't hesitate. If they know the password? Easy. And if they don't? Still possible. Especially if the account stays logged in. I stared at my laptop screen. My email stayed logged in at home. Always had. That night, lying in bed, I studied the ceiling. Linda's breathing was steady beside me. 33 years of marriage builds reflexive trust. You don't interrogate every detail. You assume alignment, but trust isn't blindness, it's informed confidence, and my confidence was thinning. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I changed every password. Email. Investment portals. Document management systems. I didn't announce it, I simply did it. Around noon, my phone buzzed. David, Thomas, I'm getting access errors on the shared trust folder. His voice was still smooth. Professional. I updated my credentials. I replied. There was a slight pause. Without notifying me? I didn't realize I needed authorization to protect my accounts. A small silence. Of course not, he said quickly. Just making sure nothing's wrong. Nothing's wrong, I said. That was my first intentional lie. Something was wrong. I just didn't know the scale yet. Later that afternoon, Linda approached me in the kitchen. Did you change passwords? She asked. Yes. Why? Routine security. She studied my face for a moment. You've never done that before. I've never felt the need. Her eyes held mine a second longer than usual. Do you not trust me? She asked quietly. There it was, the pivot. I answered carefully. I trust you. I just prefer clarity. She nodded slowly. You're overthinking, she said gently. We're just updating paperwork. Just paperwork. I returned to my office and pulled up the document revision history again. There was another change I hadn't noticed the night before, the clause about temporary reallocation of liquid holdings in anticipation of transitional restructuring. Transitional, restructuring, marital reassessment. The language wasn't random, it was anticipatory, as if planning for a change that hadn't occurred yet. I printed the entire trust file and laid it out across my desk. The structure had shifted incrementally over the past 6 months, small edits, each defensible on its own. But collectively, they increased Linda's authority significantly. They positioned David as strategic advisor in the event of separation. They reduced my veto power in certain liquidity decisions. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was directional. I leaned back in my chair. At 60, you don't fear losing money as much as you fear losing agency. Money can be rebuilt. Control, once surrendered quietly, is harder to reclaim. That evening, I did something even more deliberate. I scheduled a private consultation with a litigation attorney recommended by my old accountant. Not to file anything, not to accuse anyone, just to understand. The meeting was set for Friday. I didn't tell Linda. I didn't tell David, because before confrontation, there must be clarity, and clarity requires distance from the people who might be shaping the narrative. 2 days later, something happened that made everything feel less theoretical. I stopped by David's office unannounced. I had a legitimate reason, or so I told myself. A question about a beneficiary structure. His assistant looked surprised to see me. He's in a meeting, she said. With whom? She hesitated. I believe. Your wife. My stomach didn't drop, it tightened. That's fine, I said calmly. I'll wait. She shifted uncomfortably. They're in the private conference room. Private conference room. I nodded and took a seat. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then I heard it, laughter, not loud, but familiar, Linda's. The door at the end of the hallway opened. Linda stepped out first. Her expression shifted when she saw me, not guilt, shock, followed quickly by composure. Thomas, she said. You didn't say you were coming. I didn't know I needed an appointment, I replied lightly. David emerged behind her, adjusting his cufflinks. Thomas, he said warmly. Perfect timing. Perfect timing. The room felt smaller, not explosive, just compressed. What are we reviewing? I asked, just clarifying transitional language. David replied smoothly. Transitional. That word again. Linda avoided my eyes for half a second too long. In that fraction of hesitation, something crystallized, not proof, but alignment. The documents, the access, the quiet meetings, the incremental expansion of authority. This wasn't spontaneous, it was structured, and I had been inside the structure without realizing it. At 60, you don't expect your lawyer to position himself opposite you. You don't expect your wife to attend private legal meetings without you. You don't expect paperwork to feel like preparation, but as I stood there in that hallway, watching the two of them occupy the same air too comfortably, I understood something important. Whatever was happening, it wasn't accidental, and whatever came next, I would not be the last to know. I didn't confront them in that hallway, not because I was unsure, because I was thinking. Confrontation is emotional. Strategy is patient, clarifying transitional language, I repeated evenly. Seems like we've been doing a lot of that. David smiled the way experienced professionals do when they sense tension but refuse to acknowledge it. It's proactive planning, he said. You're at a stage of life where flexibility is key. Flexibility, that word had replaced trust. Linda stepped closer to me. We didn't want to bother you with technical details, she said softly. You've always hated the fine print. That one landed. It was true. I had always delegated technical minutiae. I built companies. Negotiated contracts. Managed teams. But when it came to estate documents, I trusted specialists. I trusted him, and I trusted her. I don't mind being bothered, I said calmly. Especially when my authority is being adjusted. David's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. No authority has been removed, he replied. Only expanded in contingency. Contingency, preparation for an event. But what event? I looked at Linda. Contingency for what? I asked. She hesitated, just slightly. For life, she said. Not divorce, not separation, life. That ambiguity was intentional. I nodded slowly. Then from now on, I said, there are no meetings without me. David responded instantly, of course. Too quickly. I left shortly after, declining coffee. When I got into my car, I didn't start the engine immediately. I replayed the body language in my mind. They hadn't looked caught, they had looked interrupted. That difference matters. On Friday, I met with the litigation attorney. Her name was Rebecca Shaw. Mid-50s. Direct. Unimpressed by prestige, I handed her a folder. Assume I'm overreacting, I said. Tell me if I am. She read silently for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally marking sections with a pen. When she finally looked up, her expression wasn't dramatic. It was analytical. Did you explicitly authorize expanded spousal liquidation rights? She asked. No. Did you knowingly designate your wife as primary co-trustee with unilateral discretion? No. Did your current counsel explain that these changes would materially shift financial control in a separation scenario? No. She leaned back. Then you're not overreacting. My pulse slowed. Explain. She tapped the documents. This structure increases her mobility significantly. In the event of marital separation, she could initiate liquidity events that disadvantage you before litigation stabilizes the estate. Could she do it alone? Under this language? Yes. Temporarily. Temporary can be permanent in financial restructuring, and him? I asked. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly. He positioned himself as advisory counsel in contingency. If she filed first, he could attempt representation. Conflict of interest? Yes. But nuanced. He structured it carefully. That word again, structured, not impulsive, not reckless, deliberate. Rebecca folded her hands. Do you believe your wife intends to separate? I hesitated. I don't know. That uncertainty is the problem. Silence settled between us. At minimum, she continued, you need independent oversight immediately. Freeze further amendments. Audit digital signatures. And under no circumstances sign anything else. I nodded. I haven't. Good. As I drove home, something shifted inside me. This wasn't about jealousy, it wasn't about insecurity, it was about control architecture. Someone had been quietly moving levers inside my life, and I had mistaken it for routine maintenance. When I walked into the house, Linda was at the kitchen island reviewing paperwork. What's that? I asked. Revised beneficiary forms, she replied casually. David suggested simplifying them. Simplifying how? Just consolidating. I stepped closer. The form included a clause redirecting certain liquid holdings into a secondary trust vehicle, controlled by her, with advisory counsel, Collins Associates. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You're moving assets, I said calmly. No, she replied quickly. We're optimizing. Optimizing, restructuring, transitional, every word chosen carefully. I spoke to another attorney today, I said. That got her attention. Her posture shifted. Why? Because I don't remember approving half of what's being drafted. Her face hardened, not dramatically, but defensively. You think I'm doing something to you? I think something is being positioned. And you don't trust me enough to ask. I am asking. Silence. She looked at me for a long moment. You've changed, she said, because I'm reading what I sign. Her jaw tightened. David says this is normal at our stage. I'm sure he does. That was the first time my tone sharpened. She noticed. Why are you suddenly suspicious? She asked quietly. Because suspicion isn't sudden, it accumulates. Because private meetings without explanation aren't neutral. Because digital signatures appearing without memory aren't harmless. Because authority expanding in contingency isn't random. I'm not suspicious, I said evenly. I'm aware. She held my gaze. You're overcomplicating this. Then explain it clearly. She opened her mouth, then closed it. That pause was louder than any argument. I don't handle the legal structure, she said finally. That's what we hired him for. Exactly. That night, I logged into the trust portal, access denied, temporary credentials required. I stared at the screen. I had full access yesterday. I picked up my phone. David, I said when he answered. Why was my access modified? Oh, he replied smoothly. We updated security layers after recent adjustments. Without informing me. It was procedural. Reverse it. Silence, that may take, reverse it, I repeated, another pause, of course. The access was restored 20 minutes later. That wasn't a glitch, that was testing perimeter, and now I knew something with certainty. I wasn't paranoid, I was behind. The next morning, I requested full digital audit logs, every signature, every revision, every access timestamp. If this was contingency planning, I needed to understand what event they were preparing for, and whether I was the only one unaware of it, because at 60, you don't fear betrayal as much as you fear being the last man in the room who knows it's coming. The audit logs arrived 48 hours later. I didn't open them immediately. There's a moment before truth where you understand that. Once you see it, you can't go back to ignorance. And ignorance, however fragile, is sometimes more comfortable than confirmation. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at my desk, and opened the file. Every access to the trust portal was listed. Time-stamped. IP logged. Device fingerprinted. At first glance, nothing seemed catastrophic. Then I filtered by late-night activity. There were multiple entries between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. over the past 4 months. I was asleep during most of them. Linda wasn't. Her laptop's device signature matched several logins. One IP address repeated frequently. David's office network. That alone wasn't incriminating. Lawyers access documents, but what tightened my chest was the overlap. Linda's login, followed minutes later by David's, then a document revision, then a signature request. One particular night stood out, 1:37 a.m. Linda login, 1:44 a.m. document modification, 1:51 a.m. digital signature from my account, 1:53 a.m. David login, 1:58 a.m. confirmation filed. I was asleep in our bed at 1:51 a.m. I knew that because I wake almost every night at 2:15 to use the bathroom. A habit of age. That night had been no different. My digital signature was placed on a document while I was sleeping beside my wife. That realization didn't feel explosive, it felt surgical, careful. Precise. Methodical. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't impulsive, it wasn't emotional, it was coordinated. That evening, I didn't confront Linda. Instead, I did something simpler. I moved my laptop out of the shared office and into a locked cabinet in my study. When Linda noticed, she didn't comment immediately. The next morning over coffee, she asked casually, reorganizing. "Yes," I said, "you've been different lately." "I've been attentive." She watched me carefully. Attentive to what? Details. Silence stretched across the kitchen. "Thomas," she said softly, "if you think something's wrong, just say it." I looked at her for a long moment. I think my signature was placed on documents at 1:51 a.m. while I was asleep. Her face didn't crumble, it didn't flush, it stilled. "What are you implying?" She asked evenly. "I'm stating a timestamp." She held eye contact. "Maybe you signed earlier and forgot." "I don't forget signing legal instruments." Another pause. "You've been under stress," she said gently. Retirement adjustment, identity shift. That was subtle, reframing suspicion as instability. I felt something settle inside me then, not anger, distance. "I've already consulted another attorney," I said. The effect was immediate, not dramatic, but visible. Her shoulders tightened slightly. "You what?" "I wanted independent clarity." "You didn't tell me." "Neither did you." That landed. Silence filled the kitchen. "Do you think I'm trying to hurt you?" She asked. "I think something is being built." I replied. "And I'm not fully inside the blueprint." She stared at me. "That's ridiculous." "Then explain the midnight revisions." "I can't control when David works." "But you can control when you log in." Her lips pressed thin. "I trust him," she said. There it was, not "I love you." Not "I'd never betray you." "I trust him." That sentence echoed louder than any confession could have. Trust displacement, and trust, once redirected, becomes alignment. Later that afternoon, Rebecca called. "I reviewed your audit logs," she said. "There's a pattern." I saw it. "You need to understand something clearly," she continued. "If a separation filing were initiated tomorrow, Under current structure, your wife could temporarily freeze or reposition certain holdings before litigation stabilizes. How temporary? Long enough to create leverage. Leverage, that word again. This isn't just estate planning, she said. This is pre-divorce positioning. My breath slowed. Are you certain? Yes. Silence. And your lawyer, she added carefully, has constructed language that allows him to represent her without obvious violation, unless challenged. Challenged, I stared out my office window at the backyard I had landscaped 20 years ago. I built this house, I funded this life, I created the trust meant to protect our children, and quietly. Incrementally, someone had engineered an exit route inside it, not explosive, elegant. If I hadn't checked timestamps, if I hadn't filtered late-night access, if I hadn't questioned small clauses, I would have signed myself into disadvantage without ever knowing. That evening, David called. Thomas, I sense tension, he said smoothly. Perhaps we should all sit down. All, I agree, I replied, tomorrow afternoon. Yes. After I hung up, Linda stood in the doorway of my office. You scheduled something? She asked. Yes. With him? With both of you. Her jaw tightened. You're escalating this. No, I said quietly. I'm entering it. She studied me differently now. Not dismissive, not reassuring, measuring. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, not from fear, from recalibration. There's a moment when suspicion transforms into certainty, not because you caught someone in an embrace, not because of a hotel receipt, but because the structure makes more sense than the marriage does. I didn't know yet whether there was a physical affair, but I knew this with clarity, they were aligned. And I was not, and tomorrow, alignment would have to stand under direct light, because I was done being the last man in the room to understand what was being prepared around him. The meeting was set for 2 p.m., I arrived early, not to catch them, that stage had passed. I arrived early because control begins with presence. David's office looked the same as always. Neutral art. Glass walls. Muted confidence. The kind of place designed to make clients feel safe handing over their future. This time, I wasn't here to feel safe, I was here to observe. Linda arrived 5 minutes later. She didn't greet me with a kiss. She didn't avoid me either. Just a controlled nod. David entered last. He carried no folders. That told me something. He expected this to be conversational. He underestimated the shift. Thomas, he began smoothly, taking his seat. Let's clear the air. I didn't sit immediately. Instead, I placed 3 printed documents on the table. Audit logs, revision history, clause comparisons. Then I sat down. No one spoke for several seconds. David scanned the first page. His expression remained composed, but slower now. More deliberate. You've been thorough, he said calmly. Yes. Linda crossed her arms. This is absurd, she said. You're acting like we're plotting something. I looked at her. Were you logged into the trust portal at 1:37 a.m. on March 14th? Silence. She didn't answer immediately. I don't remember specific dates. I do. I turned to David. Was my digital signature placed at 1:51 a.m. from my home IP address? He folded his hands. Electronic signature systems sometimes queue authorizations. Was it placed, I repeated, while I was asleep? A beat, yes. Linda looked sharply at him. He realized too late that precision had slipped. That doesn't imply fraud, he added quickly. You had pre-approved digital authority. I did not authorize midnight modifications expanding unilateral control in separation scenarios. The word separation hung in the air. Linda's composure cracked, just slightly. You keep saying that word, she said tightly. No one is separating. Then why build the exit? That was the first time the room felt charged. David leaned forward. There is no exit. There is contingency. For what event? For any event. That's vague. That's legal prudence. I held his gaze. Did you intend to represent Linda in the event of divorce? Silence. His jaw tightened. If such an event occurred, we would assess conflicts at that time. That's not what the advisory clause states. He didn't respond immediately, because he couldn't without admitting foresight. Linda looked between us. This is insane, she said. You're twisting planning into conspiracy. I slid the final document across the table, a side-by-side comparison of trust language from 6 months ago versus now, highlighted in red: expanded spousal discretion, accelerated liquidity, advisory council positioning, the structure shifts authority directionally. I said calmly. Toward you. Linda's voice sharpened. I'm your wife. Yes. And you don't think I should have protection? Protection from what? She didn't answer. David interjected. Thomas, retirement often creates psychological instability. Fear of dependency. I laughed softly. Don't pathologize awareness. His eyes flickered. He realized the power dynamic had changed. You consulted outside counsel, he said. Yes. And she agrees this is pre-divorce positioning. Linda stood abruptly. You went behind my back. I learned from the best. That hit. Silence. The air in the room felt thinner. Is there an affair? I asked quietly. The question didn't explode. It landed. Linda's face hardened. This is about paperwork. That wasn't my question. David shifted in his chair. We're not discussing personal insinuations. I am. I held Linda's gaze. She didn't look away, but she didn't answer. That silence was louder than any confession. I stood slowly. As of today, I said calmly, you are no longer my attorney. David opened his mouth to respond. Any further contact regarding my estate will go through Rebecca Shaw's office. Linda looked stunned. You're firing him? Yes. This is overreaction. No. This is correction. I turned to David. You will receive formal notice regarding potential ethical review. That landed heavier than anything else. For the first time, I saw something raw in his eyes, not fear, calculation under pressure. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. No, I replied. I already made it when I trusted incremental change. Linda's voice trembled slightly. Thomas, this doesn't have to become war. It already became strategy. I walked toward the door. Before leaving, I turned back once. If there is nothing between you, I said evenly, then transparency will clear it. Neither spoke. I left without waiting for denial. In the parking lot, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. For weeks, I had sensed structure moving around me. Now it was exposed, but exposure is only the beginning. That evening, Linda didn't come home until after 8 p.m. When she walked in, she didn't avoid me. She sat across from me at the dining table. You've blown this out of proportion, she said. Have I? Yes. Then answer one question clearly. She looked at me steadily. Are you planning to leave me? Her eyes softened, then hardened. I don't know, she said. That was the first honest sentence I'd heard in months. Not denial, not reassurance, uncertainty. And uncertainty, when paired with legal restructuring, is preparation. I nodded slowly. Then understand this, I said quietly. If you are planning to leave, you will not do it with structural advantage built in secrecy. Her expression shifted from defensive to wounded. You think I'm trying to take from you? I think someone has been moving pieces. And you don't trust me. Trust, that word again. I trust actions, I replied. Silence filled the room. At 60, you expect love to be stable, but love without transparency becomes leverage, and I was done being leveraged. That night, I slept lightly, not from fear, from readiness, because whatever was happening, whether affair, alignment, or strategic exit, it was no longer hidden, and once light enters a room, alliances change. Linda didn't sleep in our bed that night. She didn't make a scene about it. No slammed doors. No dramatic packing. She simply took a blanket and pillow to the guest room. The quiet was heavier than shouting would have been. At 6:12 a.m., my phone buzzed. Not a text, an email notification, from Rebecca. Subject, urgent, filing activity. I opened it immediately. At 5:47 a.m., a preliminary marital asset disclosure inquiry had been initiated through a legal portal, filed by Collins Associates. On behalf of Linda Mercer, The room went completely still. I read it twice to make sure my eyes weren't rushing ahead of my understanding. Preliminary marital asset disclosure. That wasn't just paperwork. That was step one in structured separation. It didn't mean divorce had been filed, it meant groundwork had begun, and it had begun this morning, before sunrise. While she was still in my house, I walked slowly down the hallway and knocked on the guest room door. Linda. Silence. Then, what? I opened the door. She was sitting upright on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, not surprised, prepared. You filed asset disclosure this morning, I said calmly. She didn't deny it. It's precautionary. For what? In case things escalate. They escalated when you initiated legal inquiry without telling me. Her jaw tightened. You fired my attorney. He was my attorney. He's been advising us. No, I said quietly. He's been advising you. Silence. She stood up. I needed protection. From me? From instability. Whose instability? She didn't answer. Instead, she said something that shifted everything. You changed, Thomas. How? You became controlling. Suspicious. Cold. Cold, because I asked questions, because I checked timestamps, because I hired independent counsel. You built contingency without me, I said evenly. That's not protection. That's positioning. Her eyes flashed. You always managed everything. The money. The decisions. I wanted some control. There it was, control, not romance. Not passion, power, and you chose him to build it. I asked. She looked away for the first time. That was answer enough. Is there an affair? I asked again. This time she didn't deflect. Yes. The word was quiet, controlled, but definitive. It didn't shatter the room, it clarified it. How long? I asked. 6 months. 6 months, exactly the timeline of incremental trust revisions. It wasn't coincidence, it was coordinated evolution. Was the legal restructuring your idea? I asked. No, his. Yes. There it was, alignment confirmed, not just emotional, strategic. He said I needed leverage, she continued. In case you tried to minimize me in divorce. I almost smiled. I never minimized you. You controlled everything. I managed what I built. And where did that leave me? The question wasn't hysterical, it was honest, and painful. It left you married, I said. It left me dependent. Silence. Dependence, that word carries weight in long marriages. Did you love him? I asked. She hesitated. I don't know. That uncertainty mattered more than a declaration. Did you plan to leave? I asked. Yes. Not someday, not hypothetically, yes. The clarity hurt less than ambiguity. When? I asked. After year-end restructuring. Of course, after liquidity realignment, after asset positioning, after advisory clauses solidified. David wasn't just her affair partner, he was her architect, and you were going to let him represent you, I said. Yes. The precision of that answer was almost clinical, and you thought I'd sign everything quietly. He said you wouldn't notice until it was too late. I nodded slowly. That was his assessment, predictable, delegating, trusting. At 60, he miscalculated one thing. I looked. Are you still planning to leave? I asked. She held my gaze. I don't know anymore. That uncertainty was new, because leverage had shifted. You filed disclosure, I said. That's not uncertainty. It's protection. From what? She didn't answer. Instead she said something that reframed everything. He made it sound necessary. He made, not we decided, he made. The dynamic had depth I hadn't fully considered. You think he manipulated you? I asked. She exhaled slowly. I think he positioned me. That word again, positioned, the same language Rebecca used, the same language the trust reflected, the same architecture everywhere. This wasn't just an affair, it was influence layered with advantage. I'm freezing all discretionary authority effective immediately, I said calmly. Rebecca will file protective motion. Linda's eyes widened slightly. You're going nuclear. No, I said. I'm stabilizing. She sat back down on the bed. He told me you'd react like this. Like what? Like a CEO. That stung, because it was partially true. I reacted like someone whose signature was placed at 1:51 a.m. while he was asleep. I replied, silence. The air between us felt different now, less confusion, more inevitability. Are you going to leave? She asked quietly, are you? I replied, another long pause. I don't know, she said again. That wasn't indecision, that was recalculation. Later that morning, Rebecca called. He filed too early, she said. That was aggressive. What does it mean? It means he thought you were still asleep. Not physically, strategically, he moved because you confronted him, she continued. That filing wasn't precautionary. It was leverage escalation. So now? Now we counter. How? By filing conflict of interest motion and requesting immediate stay on structural changes. Will that stop him? It will expose him. Exposure, that's what shifts power. At noon, David called. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. Thomas, this doesn't have to spiral. We can resolve this professionally. Professionally, he'd blurred professional and personal for 6 months, now he wanted structure again. I didn't return the call. Instead, I sent one message, all further communication through counsel. Short, clean, final. That evening, Linda stood in the doorway of my office. I didn't expect this. She said quietly, you expected me to sign quietly. She didn't deny it. I expected you to trust me. I trusted you, I replied. You built contingency. Silence. I never wanted to hurt you, she said, but you wanted leverage. Yes. That honesty hurt more than the affair, because love can falter, but strategy requires intention. Is he in love with you? I asked. She hesitated. I think he's in love with winning. That answer chilled the room, because it meant she was beginning to see something, and when perception shifts, alliances fracture. Outside, the sun was setting behind the trees we planted 20 years ago. Inside, the architecture of our marriage had already shifted. Not because of passion, because of positioning, and now, the man who built my trust, had to defend his own. The next 48 hours were no longer about emotion, they were about containment. Rebecca filed the conflict of interest motion before noon. It was precise, restrained, and devastatingly clear. She didn't accuse David of an affair. She didn't need to. She outlined access patterns. Midnight revisions. Pre-separation positioning. Advisory clauses structured to benefit one party. Then she requested an immediate judicial review of representation eligibility, clean, professional, lethal. At 3:17 p.m., David called again. This time I answered, you've escalated unnecessarily. He said, voice tight but controlled, no, I replied calmly. You moved first. That filing was precautionary. At 5:47 a.m. Silence. You blindsided Linda by firing counsel. You ceased being my counsel months ago. Another silence. You're making assumptions about intent, he said. I'm reading structure. You don't understand the full context. Then explain it. A beat. It would be inappropriate to discuss certain elements without her present. There it was again, alignment. He wasn't speaking as neutral counsel, he was speaking as partner, in more ways than one. I'm not interested in context, I said quietly. I'm interested in ethics. The word landed heavier than anything else. His tone shifted slightly. You're threatening my professional standing. You threatened my financial autonomy. That's dramatic. No, I said. It's arithmetic. We ended the call without resolution. That evening, Linda didn't retreat to the guest room. She stayed in the living room, seated on the couch we bought 15 years ago. The same couch where David once sat explaining asset distribution models. Rebecca filed against him. She said quietly, yes. He's furious. I imagine. You're going to ruin his career. No, I replied evenly. His choices are doing that. Silence. He told me you would attack if cornered, she said. I'm not attacking. I'm defending. She looked at me carefully. You don't look angry. I'm not. That unsettled her. Anger she could frame as volatility, calm she could not. I need to know something, I said. What? Did he ever suggest I was unstable? Her eyes flickered. Yes. How? He said retirement can create paranoia. Loss of control. Identity anxiety. That was clever, preemptively undermining credibility, positioning me as reactive. He hadn't just built financial leverage, he'd built narrative leverage, and you believed him? I asked, at first. Maybe. There was honesty in that, and now? She hesitated. Now I think he needed you to look unstable. Because if I appeared irrational. His advisory position strengthened. If I reacted emotionally, his protection narrative justified asset shielding. It was elegant, predatory. You weren't just having an affair, I said quietly. You were inside a strategy. Her face tightened. I didn't see it that way. Of course you didn't. She stood and paced slowly. He said you'd never change the structure voluntarily. That you'd protect yourself first. And so he protected you first. Yes. There it was, the real fracture, not romance, alignment built on perceived imbalance. I never planned to leave empty-handed, she said softly. I never planned to leave at all, I replied. Silence. In that silence lived 33 years of shared history. And 6 months of quiet erosion. The next morning, Rebecca called again. Judge scheduled preliminary review for conflict claim, she said. David's firm responded aggressively. How? They're framing you as overreaching. I expected that. They also filed a motion requesting temporary spousal asset review citing hostile environment concerns. I almost laughed. Hostile. They're constructing narrative. Of course they were. Every structure requires story, and the story they were building positioned Linda as vulnerable and me as controlling. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so strategic. Can he still represent her? I asked. For now, yes. But if we establish material conflict due to prior representation of you, he'll be forced to withdraw. And if he withdraws, she'll need new counsel. Which destabilizes timing. Timing, that's what this was always about, control of sequence, control of leverage, control of who acts first. That afternoon, I received something I hadn't expected, an email, from one of David's junior associates, short. Careful, subject, confidential, I believe you should review attached communication for context. Attached were internal firm emails, between David and 2 partners. The language was cautious but revealing. Client husband unlikely to review clause depth. Position liquidity flexibility before Q4. If separation initiated post-restructure. Advantage secured. Advantage secured, there it was in writing, not romantic language, not emotional confession, strategic, calculated. I read it twice, then forwarded it to Rebecca. Within minutes, my phone rang. This changes everything, she said. How? That email suggests intent to structure for adversarial advantage while representing both parties. That's not nuance. That's breach. Silence. He miscalculated, she continued. He assumed you wouldn't look. He wasn't alone. That evening, I showed Linda the email. She read it slowly, her hands trembled, not dramatically, but noticeably. He never showed me this, she said. Of course he didn't. Her breathing shifted. This wasn't about us, she whispered. No, I said quietly. It was about advantage. She sank into a chair. I thought I was protecting myself. You were being positioned. Silence filled the room again, different this time, less defensive, more fractured. Did he love you? I asked one last time. She shook her head slowly. I think he loved control. That answer didn't comfort me, but it clarified something. She hadn't left for passion, she'd aligned for power, and now the architect of that alignment was exposed. The following morning, Rebecca filed supplemental evidence including the internal email. By noon, David's firm requested emergency conference, by 4 p.m. He formally withdrew from representing Linda. The alliance fractured under light. When Linda received confirmation, she stared at the email for a long time. He won't answer my calls, she said quietly, because once leverage collapses, so does attraction built on it. I didn't feel victorious, I felt awake. For 6 months, structure had moved quietly around me, now it was visible. And visibility changes everything, but exposure doesn't restore trust, it only removes illusion. The real question remained, not whether he manipulated her, not whether she aligned with him, but whether a marriage built over 3 decades can survive when its foundation was tested, not by passion, but by strategy. When David withdrew, the house felt quieter, not peaceful, just hollow. For the first time in months, there were no late-night notifications, no quiet conference calls in the guest room, no technical clarifications. The strategist had exited the board, but the pieces were still scattered. Linda sat at the kitchen table long after sunset, her phone face down beside her. He won't respond, she said again, almost to herself. Of course he wouldn't. Once conflict of interest exposure hit, contact became liability. Whatever he felt, attraction, ambition, ego, it would now be filtered through self-preservation. That's what men like him protect first, themselves. You were useful to him, I said calmly. She flinched. That's cruel. No, I replied. It's accurate. Silence. She looked up at me, not angry, just stripped of narrative. He said you'd turn on me, she whispered. I didn't turn on you, I said evenly. I turned on the light. The difference matters. The next week unfolded in procedural precision. Rebecca filed a motion to audit all trust modifications over the past year. Temporary restraining protections froze discretionary movement. Linda retained new counsel, a woman named Karen Doyle, sharp-eyed and methodical. The first joint meeting with new counsel felt entirely different from the one with David. No familiarity. No subtle glances, no shared subtext, just legal framing. Karen addressed Linda first. My responsibility is to protect your interests, she said. But we need full transparency about how prior representation evolved. Linda hesitated. I don't know what he did intentionally, she admitted. That's not what I asked, Karen replied gently. Did you understand the structural advantage being built? Linda exhaled, yes. That was the first time she said it without qualification. Karen nodded slowly. Then you were not misled. You were aligned. The word hung between us, aligned. Linda's voice softened. I thought I needed leverage. Against your husband? Karen asked. Against being erased. The honesty startled me. Erased? I repeated. She met my eyes. You ran everything. Every financial decision. Every structure. I didn't know where I stood. You stood beside me, I said quietly, not inside the architecture. That sentence stayed with me, because it wasn't entirely false. I built the company, I structured the accounts, I drove long-term strategy. She participated, but she didn't design, and over time, design becomes power. I would have shared control, I said. You say that now. Silence. Karen leaned back. The affair complicates everything, she said plainly. But legally, this becomes about intent. Intent, Rebecca spoke evenly. Intent is documented in internal firm communication. Karen nodded, yes. Which weakens prior counsel significantly. But it doesn't erase marital fracture. This wasn't about winning, it was about what remained after leverage collapsed. Later that night, Linda and I sat in the living room, no attorneys, no paperwork, just distance. I never meant to become your adversary, she said quietly. You became aligned with one. I felt small, she admitted. I studied her. Linda had never been small. She was intelligent. Capable. Socially confident. But financial design had always been my domain. He made it sound like I'd be left behind, she continued. That if something happened to you, I'd be dependent on structures I didn't understand. I would never have left you exposed. You didn't explain things, she said softly. That landed, because clarity shared is power shared, and maybe I had been too comfortable holding it. but you didn't ask, I replied, because I thought you'd dismiss me. Silence, not explosive, not accusatory, just layered. The affair had begun as proximity. Late meetings. Shared analysis. Quiet validation. Then evolved into emotional alliance, but underneath it all was insecurity, and underneath that, architecture. I need to ask you something honestly, she said. Ask. If he hadn't been exposed, would you have noticed? Yes, eventually, but maybe too late. I don't know, I admitted. That was truth, and truth doesn't always strengthen position. She nodded faintly. That's what he counted on. We sat quietly for a long time. 33 years of marriage don't evaporate in a week, but they don't shield against structural betrayal either. I don't love him, she said suddenly. I didn't respond. I thought I did, she continued. But I loved feeling protected. Protection, that word again. Protection can look like control when you don't understand its cost, and now? I asked. She hesitated. Now I feel exposed. Because leverage was gone, alliance fractured, architecture dismantled. I'm not your enemy, I said quietly, you feel like one. Because I refuse to be managed. Silence, she nodded slowly, yes. That was perhaps the most honest exchange we'd had in months. The following morning, Rebecca called with an update. Preliminary review suggests ethical inquiry will proceed, she said. He's in defensive posture. And Linda? She's vulnerable legally but not catastrophic. If divorce proceeds, we can neutralize structural advantage. If divorce proceeds, that phrase no longer felt hypothetical. That evening, Linda stood at the window watching the sunset. I don't know if we can come back from this, she said quietly. Neither do I, she turned toward me. If we try. There can't be hidden structures. There won't be. And no more unilateral control. Agreed. And full transparency. Yes. She swallowed, and you can't look at me like I'm your opponent. That one was harder, because for months, she had been, I don't want an opponent, I said. I want alignment. She stepped closer, without leverage. Yes. Silence, that was the real question, not whether the affair happened, not whether David miscalculated, not whether legal structures were repaired, but whether two people can rebuild. After discovering that love was quietly replaced by positioning. At 60, you don't fear starting over as much as you fear rebuilding on unstable ground. And for the first time since this began, there were no lawyers in the room, no clauses, no midnight revisions, no advisory language, just two people, deciding whether trust can be restored, once it's been used as a strategy. The weeks that followed weren't explosive, they were slow, and slow is harder. Legal pressure continued to mount against David. The ethics inquiry moved forward. His firm distanced itself publicly from the restructuring language. Quiet damage control. Quiet repositioning, but inside our house, the real work was quieter still. Linda moved back into our bedroom, but nothing felt normal. We didn't touch in our sleep. We didn't reach automatically for each other's hands. We coexisted, not hostile, not reconciled, suspended. One evening, I asked her something I hadn't dared ask before. When did you first think about leaving? She didn't pretend to misunderstand. Last winter, she said, that aligned with the first structural amendments. What triggered it? You retired. I absorbed that. I thought retirement would bring us closer, I said. It brought you home, she replied softly. But not closer. That sentence hurt because it was partially true. I had been physically present, but still operating like a CEO. Schedules. Projects. Financial updates. Strategic planning. I managed the household like an enterprise, and enterprises don't require emotional check-ins. They say men lose identity when they retire, she continued. But you didn't lose yours. You tightened it. I leaned back, tightened. You doubled down on control. Control again, the word threaded through everything. I built our security, I said. Yes, she replied. But I didn't feel inside it. Silence. This wasn't justification, it wasn't absolution, it was context. And context doesn't erase betrayal, but it complicates it. I never wanted to take from you, she said. I wanted something that was mine. You chose him to build it. Yes. Because he validated you. Yes. And because he understood structure. She nodded. That alignment, validation plus architecture, had been powerful. But architecture without integrity collapses. The following week, the court issued a preliminary finding. Conflict of interest review would proceed formally. David was barred from any representation involving either of us pending investigation. It wasn't disbarment, but it was public scrutiny. When Linda read the notice, her hands shook slightly. I didn't think it would go this far, she whispered. He thought I wouldn't look, I replied. Silence. I don't want him destroyed, she said. I don't want him powerful. That difference mattered. One evening, we sat across from each other at the dining table, the same table where trust amendments had once been signed casually. No lawyers, she said quietly. No lawyers, I agreed. Do you want a divorce? She asked directly. I didn't answer immediately, because this wasn't about anger, it was about viability. I don't know, I said honestly. She nodded slowly. I don't either. The uncertainty was mutual now, not tactical, real. If we divorce, I said carefully, it will be equitable. Not strategic. I don't want strategic anymore, she said. That was new, because for months, strategic had felt like safety. What do you want? I asked. She exhaled, to not feel small. The honesty disarmed me more than any argument could. You were never small, I said. I felt replaceable. Replaceable. At 60, that word lands deep. I never replaced you, I replied quietly. You structured everything without me. And you structured an exit without me. Silence. The symmetry was painful. We had both built structures, mine around protection, hers around leverage, neither around transparency. I don't love him, she said again. I know. I don't know if I love you the same way. That hurt more, but it was cleaner than illusion. I don't know if I love you the same way either, I admitted. That was the first fully mutual truth, not accusation, not defense, just recognition that something had shifted fundamentally. The next morning, I walked through the house slowly. Past the office where trust documents were reviewed, past the kitchen where midnight revisions were dismissed as routine. Past the living room where David once sat confidently describing optimization. The architecture was gone, but the memory of it remained. I called Rebecca. If we paused everything, I said, legally and procedurally, what happens? You mean suspend active motion? Yes. You'd maintain protective measures but halt escalation. And the ethics review? That proceeds independently. I nodded. File to pause adversarial motion, I said. There was a pause. You're sure? Yes. This wasn't surrender, it was de-escalation. That evening, I told Linda. I paused litigation escalation. Her eyes widened slightly. Why? Because I don't want to build another structure based on fear. Silence. You're not trying to win. She asked. I'm trying to decide. She stepped closer. For what it's worth, she said quietly, he told me you'd go nuclear. I went structural. She almost smiled. That's very you. Maybe it was, but structure doesn't have to be weaponized, it can also stabilize. Days turned into weeks. Therapy began, not dramatic, uncomfortable, honest. One session, the therapist asked her directly, when you aligned with him, what did you feel? She hesitated. Seen. And with your husband? The therapist asked. She looked at me, managed. That was difficult to hear, but clarity is rarely gentle. And you? The therapist asked me, what did you feel when you discovered the restructuring? Erased, I said. There it was, both of us afraid of erasure, both of us building defenses, different methods, same fear. That realization shifted something, not forgiveness, understanding. Months passed, the ethics review continued quietly in the background. David's name faded from daily conversation, not because it didn't matter, but because the real work wasn't about him anymore. It was about whether two people who had weaponized structure could relearn vulnerability. One night, Linda reached for my hand, not dramatically, tentatively. I don't want leverage anymore, she said softly. Then we rebuild without it, I replied. She squeezed my hand, even if it's slower. Especially if it's slower. Because slow rebuilding isn't strategic, it's intentional. At 60, you learn something about betrayal, the affair hurts, the manipulation angers, but the deepest wound isn't the act, it's the realization that someone you trusted was preparing for life without you, before telling you. Now the question wasn't whether she'd leave, it was whether we could stay, without strategy, and that answer wouldn't be decided in court. It would be decided quietly. In ordinary days, without leverage, rebuilding is less dramatic than collapse. There are no headlines, no filings, no sudden shifts, just daily choices. Some mornings we spoke easily. Other mornings the distance returned without warning. Trust doesn't regenerate in a straight line. It moves in small increments, forward, sideways, sometimes back. The ethics investigation into David continued quietly in the background. We didn't discuss it much anymore. His name felt like an artifact from another chapter, but consequences move whether you watch them or not. One afternoon, Rebecca called. The review board issued preliminary findings, she said. Serious ethical concerns. He'll likely face suspension. I didn't feel triumph, I felt something closer to completion. Thank you, I said simply. When I told Linda, she sat down slowly. I never wanted this to destroy him, she whispered. It didn't, I replied. It exposed him. Exposure isn't cruelty, it's correction, she nodded, but I could see the weight in her expression. Whatever illusion she'd held about him, as protector, as strategist, as ally, had dissolved fully now. You were right, she said quietly. I wasn't trying to be right. I know. Silence settled between us. I need to say something without you reacting like a CEO, she added. I almost smiled. Go ahead. I was lonely before I was disloyal. That sentence hung in the air, lonely, inside a house, inside a marriage, inside security. I let it sit before responding. I didn't see that, I said. No, she replied. You saw structure. And that was true. I had equated stability with connection. If the finances were strong, the house maintained, the plans clear, I assumed the marriage was safe. But marriages don't run on spreadsheets, they run on attention. Weeks turned into months, therapy shifted from crisis management to exploration. We revisited years of small patterns, my habit of deciding quickly, her habit of deferring publicly and resenting privately, my tendency to fix, her tendency to internalize. None of it justified what happened, but it explained how cracks formed. One evening, nearly a year after that first midnight audit log, we sat on the back porch watching the sky fade into blue-gray. Do you still think about him? I asked. Sometimes, she admitted, with regret. With clarity. I studied her face. What does clarity look like? He wasn't building a life with me, she said. He was building leverage. That distinction mattered, and you? She asked. Sometimes I still replay the 1:51 a.m. timestamp. She winced slightly. I'm sorry. I know. There's a difference between apology and repair. We were working on repair, slowly, carefully, without hidden clauses. Eventually, the review board issued its final decision. David was suspended for 18 months pending further disciplinary review. No criminal charges, but public record. His firm issued a statement distancing itself from individual conduct. When I read the notice, I felt something close, not anger, not victory, finality. I showed it to Linda. She didn't speak for a long time. I thought he was powerful, she said softly. He was, I replied. Until he wasn't. Power built on access collapses when access is questioned. That's the lesson. Months later, we revisited the divorce conversation, not in anger, in honesty. If we separated now, I said one evening, it wouldn't be strategic. No, she agreed. It would just be sad. That was progress, not because sadness is pleasant, but because it's human, not tactical. Human. Do you want to stay? I asked. She didn't hesitate this time. Yes. Not out of fear, not out of leverage, out of choice. And you? She asked. I considered carefully. I want to stay, I said, but staying meant something different now. It meant shared passwords, shared oversight, shared decisions. It meant no unilateral authority. It meant transparency without being asked. It meant explaining structure instead of managing it. It meant vulnerability where control used to sit. We revised the trust together. Not through David, not through secrecy, line by line, authority balanced, discretion mutual, no hidden contingency language. At the signing, Linda looked at me and said, "This feels different." "It is," I replied. "Why?" "Because there's no leverage." She nodded. For the first time since this began, the document felt like protection, not positioning. Years pass quickly in your 60s, time compresses. One evening, nearly 2 years after the exposure, I found myself sitting alone in the living room. The house was quiet. Linda was upstairs. I opened the trust portal, not because I suspected anything, but because awareness had become habit. Everything was in order. Transparent, shared. I closed the laptop and leaned back. The betrayal hadn't destroyed us, but it had dismantled illusion, and sometimes illusion is what holds marriages together. Without it, you're left with choice, daily choice, not comfort, not inertia, choice. Linda came downstairs and sat beside me. "You're checking again?" she asked gently. "Yes." "Do you still need to?" I thought about it. "No," I said honestly. "But I like knowing I can." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "Thank you for not becoming cruel," she whispered. "I didn't want to win," I said quietly. I wanted clarity. At 60, betrayal feels different than it does at 30. It's not just about broken vows. It's about broken architecture, but architecture can be redesigned, if both people choose to stay, and we did, not because the past disappeared, but because leverage did, and without leverage, there's nothing left but honesty, and honesty, however uncomfortable, is stronger than strategy. Time didn't erase what happened, it reframed it. 3 years passed, not in dramatic reconciliations or grand romantic gestures, but in ordinary mornings. Coffee. Shared errands. Quiet dinners. Occasional arguments that no longer felt like positioning battles. The affair became part of our history, not our daily language. David's name surfaced less and less. His suspension extended after further review. Eventually, he relocated to another state. Smaller firm. Less visibility. He had built leverage professionally the same way he built it personally, until scrutiny made it collapse. But the real question was never about him, it was about us. One evening, Linda said something that surprised me. "I don't feel small anymore." I looked at her. "Why?" "Because I understand the structure now." That mattered, not just the legal structure, the emotional one. We'd spent months unpacking how our dynamic evolved. I'd handled the financial architecture because I was comfortable there. She deferred because it was easier. Over time, comfort turned into imbalance, imbalance turned into insecurity. Insecurity met validation from someone who understood leverage, and leverage felt like power, but power without integrity corrodes the person holding it. "I should have invited you into everything years ago," I said. "You should have," she agreed, no anger in her tone, just recognition. "And I should have asked instead of building an exit," she added. That symmetry was the only honest place to stand. We didn't romanticize what happened, we didn't pretend we were stronger because of it, we were different because of it, more alert, more communicative, less automatic. There's something about aging that simplifies priorities. At 63, I no longer cared about being right. I cared about being aligned. One afternoon, we sat with Rebecca to finalize updated estate plans, fully transparent, jointly structured. She reviewed the documents and smiled faintly. "This is balanced," she said. "It should have been," I replied. Linda squeezed my hand under the table. Not dramatic, not desperate, deliberate. Later that night, she asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you still see me as someone who would betray you?" I didn't answer quickly, because trust, once fractured, doesn't regenerate in full. "I see you as someone who made a strategic mistake," I said honestly. She nodded. "That's fair." "And I see myself as someone who missed the warning signs." I added, "That's also fair." There was no illusion left, only awareness, and awareness is heavier, but sturdier. Years ago, when I caught that 1:51 a.m. timestamp, I thought my life was splitting, now I see it differently. It wasn't a split, it was a reveal, the reveal of how easily trust can be reframed into leverage, how quickly validation can override loyalty, how silently structure can shift when no one is watching. But it also revealed something else, that I was capable of standing up without rage, of defending without destroying, of correcting without cruelty. That mattered more than keeping the marriage intact, because if I had become vindictive, if I had chosen to crush instead of clarify, I would have lost something fundamental about myself. One evening, years later, we were sitting on the back porch when Linda said quietly, "I was wrong. Not about David, not about the filing, about something deeper. I confused leverage with safety." I nodded, and I confused control with protection. I replied, there it was, the core of it, two people afraid of losing relevance, two people building defenses, two people forgetting to build connection. We didn't get a cinematic ending, there was no dramatic reconciliation scene, no public apology, no vow renewal, just quieter days, and shared passwords, and transparent conversations. And a marriage rebuilt not on illusion, but on deliberate choice. Sometimes I still wake at 1:51 a.m. Old habits. I don't check audit logs anymore, I don't scan legal portals, I simply lie there and listen to the quiet, because now the quiet means something different, not hidden movement, not repositioning, just stillness. At 60, betrayal feels like erasure. At 63, it feels like education, and the lesson wasn't about lawyers or affairs. It was about paying attention before someone else designs your future for you. My wife and my lawyer betrayed me together, but what saved me wasn't revenge, it was awareness, and awareness, once earned the hard way, doesn't fade. 5 years passed, that's long enough for memory to soften, but not disappear. Linda and I stayed married, not because it was easy, not because it was romantic, not because we erased what happened. We stayed because we made a deliberate decision every day not to turn strategy back on each other. But here's the part no one talks about, even when a marriage survives betrayal, something fundamental changes in the survivor. Not paranoia, calibration. I no longer assume alignment, I confirm it. I no longer trust structures, I read them, and I no longer mistake quiet for safety. One afternoon, I received a call I didn't expect. It was from a former client of David's. He'd heard about the disciplinary action and was reviewing his own estate documents. "Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "I was told you had experience." Experience, that's one word for it. He came over the next day with a folder under his arm. Mid-60s. Recently retired. Wife involved in restructuring. I watched him flip through clauses the way I once had, casually, trusting tone more than language. "This all looks standard, right?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked him one question: who benefits first if separation occurs? He blinked. "I don't know." Exactly. We spent 2 hours reviewing his documents, nothing illegal, nothing obvious. Just directional shifts, small expansions of spousal discretion, accelerated liquidity triggers, advisory positioning. It wasn't identical to mine, but it rhymed. When he left, he looked different, less comfortable, more aware. Linda stood in the hallway after he drove away. "You helped him," she said. "Yes." "Because of us?" "Yes." Silence. "I hate that we became a lesson," she said quietly. "We were always going to be one," I replied. "About what?" "About what happens when access replaces honesty." That's what David understood, access. He had access to my finances, access to my vulnerabilities, access to my wife's insecurity. Access is power, and power without accountability drifts toward leverage. That night, Linda sat beside me on the couch. "Do you still think I was manipulated?" she asked. I considered carefully. "You were influenced," I said. "That's not the same." "No." Silence. "I chose it," she admitted. "Yes." "And you chose not to destroy me." "Yes." That was the quiet truth. I could have gone further, filed more aggressively, pushed for harsher penalties. I didn't, not because I lacked anger, because I didn't want my identity tied to annihilation. At 65, destruction feels exhausting, clarity feels stronger. Years later, the marriage isn't soft, it's deliberate. We don't assume loyalty, we demonstrate it. We don't avoid difficult conversations. We schedule them. We don't build exits in secret. We discuss fear openly. That's the difference. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the house settled into its usual quiet, Linda asked me something unexpected: if he hadn't been exposed, would you have forgiven me? I didn't rush the answer. No, I said honestly. She nodded. That's fair. Because forgiveness without truth isn't forgiveness, I added. It's surrender. Silence. And if I had left? She asked. I would have survived. That's the real shift. At 60, I was afraid of erasure. At 65, I understand something better. You cannot be erased if you remain present, not financially, not emotionally, not structurally. I caught them before the exit finalized, but what mattered wasn't catching them, it was deciding who I would become after: bitter, vindictive, paranoid, or awake. I chose awake, and being awake means something simple: you don't outsource your life, not to lawyers, not to lovers, not to comfort. You stay inside your own structure. You read what you sign. You ask what you don't understand. You listen when something feels misaligned. My wife and my lawyer betrayed me together, but they also revealed something I didn't know I'd lost: attention. And attention, once reclaimed, is power no one can quietly reposition. That's not the end of the story. That's the part that stays with you long after it's over. There's one more layer to this story. Not about betrayal, not about law, about identity. When a man reaches 60, he starts measuring what remains instead of what's ahead. You begin to notice how much of your life has already been built, and how little appetite you have for rebuilding from ashes. That's why what happened between Linda and David cut deeper than infidelity. It wasn't youth and passion, it was calculation at the edge of aging. One morning, nearly 6 years after everything unraveled, I woke up before sunrise. The house was quiet. Linda was still asleep beside me. For a moment, I thought about the night I discovered the midnight signatures. 1:51 a.m., the number doesn't sting anymore, it informs. I slipped out of bed and went into my study. Opened the trust portal. Not because I suspected anything, but because awareness became ritual, everything balanced. Transparent. Joint authorization required for any discretionary shift, no unilateral control, no hidden clauses, no transitional restructuring. I closed the laptop and leaned back. Linda walked in a few minutes later. You're checking again, she said gently. Yes. Still afraid? No, I replied. Just disciplined. That's the difference. Fear reacts, discipline verifies. She sat across from me. I sometimes wonder who I would be if this never happened. She said, you'd still feel small. I answered honestly. She didn't flinch, probably. And I'd still assume control equals protection. We both smiled faintly. Painful truths lose their sting when they're spoken often enough. A few months later, we attended a retirement gathering for an old colleague. Conversations drifted to estate planning, asset transfers, second marriages. One man joked, you never really know what your lawyer's planning. Everyone laughed. I didn't. Afterward, one of them pulled me aside. I heard something happened with your former attorney, he said quietly. It did. He hesitated. My wife has been asking more questions about restructuring lately. Should I be concerned? There it was again, concern. I didn't feed paranoia. I gave him clarity. Don't assume anything, I said. Just read everything. He nodded slowly. That's the quiet legacy of betrayal. You become the man who warns others without dramatizing. Years ago, I thought masculinity meant control. Now I think it means awareness. Control can be taken, awareness must be surrendered. Linda joined me on the drive home. You don't hate him anymore, do you? She asked. No, why not? Because he already lost. Not just professionally, strategically. Men like David depend on asymmetry, information asymmetry, emotional asymmetry, structural asymmetry. Once exposed, their advantage evaporates. What about me? She asked carefully. I looked at her. You didn't lose, I said. Sometimes I think I did. You lost leverage, I replied. Not me. Silence filled the car. At 66, love isn't fireworks, it's maintenance, it's deliberate check-ins, transparent access, shared passwords, scheduled conversations about fear. It's less romantic, more resilient. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't checked the audit logs, if I'd dismissed discomfort, if I'd trusted tone over structure. I would have been negotiating from weakness without knowing it. That's the real betrayal, not the affair, the positioning. And here's what I've learned: affairs are emotional, positioning is strategic. Strategic betrayal cuts deeper because it assumes you won't notice. But I did notice, not immediately, not dramatically, but eventually, and eventually is enough. Linda once asked me, years later, "Do you regret staying?" I didn't answer quickly. No, I said finally. Why? Because we rebuilt honestly. And if we hadn't, I would have left honestly. That's the part people misunderstand. Survival of the marriage wasn't the victory, clarity was. I caught them building an exit, but I rebuilt the house differently, not with thicker walls, with clearer windows. At 67, I no longer fear losing everything. I fear not paying attention, and that fear keeps me awake in the best possible way. My wife and my lawyer betrayed me together, but they never erased me, because the moment I chose to look, I stopped being manageable, and once you stop being manageable, no one can quietly redesign your life again. 7 years later, something unexpected happened, not a relapse, not another affair. Not a secret clause buried in legal language, something quieter. Linda handed me a folder one afternoon and said, "I want you to read this." It wasn't a trust amendment, it wasn't a financial document, it was a letter, handwritten, dated the week before everything collapsed. "I never gave this to you," she said. I read it slowly. In it, she wrote about feeling invisible, about watching me move through retirement like a man running a company instead of living a marriage, about meeting David initially for structure, but staying for validation, about convincing herself she needed leverage because she believed I would always choose control over connection. There was no mention of love for him, no dramatic declarations. Just insecurity layered with justification. Halfway through the letter, one line stopped me. "I don't know if I want to leave Thomas, or if I just want to feel like I could." That sentence explained more than the affair ever did. Power isn't always about taking. Sometimes it's about knowing you can. I looked up. "Why didn't you give me this?" I asked. "Because if I had," she said quietly, "you would have fixed it." She wasn't wrong. I would have optimized, adjusted, rebalanced, managed, but I wouldn't have understood. The affair forced understanding, the structure forced attention. That's the cruel paradox. Sometimes clarity requires collapse. That night, we sat in the living room long after dark. "I don't want leverage," she said again. "You don't have it," I replied gently. "I don't want the fear either." Then we keep talking before it turns into architecture. That's the rule now. No silent restructuring, no internal exits. No secret alliances. Fear gets spoken before it becomes strategy. Months later, something else shifted. Our daughter, Emily, asked us directly over dinner, "Did you almost divorce?" Children always know more than you think. "Yes," I answered honestly. She nodded slowly. "Why didn't you?" Linda looked at me before answering. "Because we were both wrong," she said. That was the cleanest explanation possible. Not villain and victim, two people afraid of losing relevance in different ways. After dinner, Emily pulled me aside. "I'm glad you didn't go nuclear," she said. I smiled faintly. "So am I." Going nuclear would have satisfied pride, it wouldn't have satisfied peace. A few years later, when I turned 70, we renewed nothing, no vows, no ceremony. We hosted a quiet dinner with close friends. At one point, someone joked about surviving marriage. Linda looked at me and said softly, "We didn't survive. We redesigned." That word stayed with me, redesigned, not out of ambition, out of necessity. And here's the truth I understand now. At 70, the affair wasn't the deepest betrayal. The assumption was, the assumption that I wouldn't look, the assumption that I wouldn't question, the assumption that I preferred comfort over clarity. They both made that assumption, and they were wrong, not because I was smarter. Because I was willing to be uncomfortable. If I had to summarize the entire story, years of quiet tension, legal filings, midnight timestamps, therapy sessions, ethical investigations, it would be this: pay attention before someone else positions you, love your partner enough to invite them into the structure, respect yourself enough to read what you sign, and never let fear build architecture in silence. My wife and my lawyer betrayed me together. But they also gave me something I didn't know I was missing: agency. And agency, once reclaimed, is the one asset no one can restructure behind your back. That's not just an ending, that's the foundation I stand on now, and at 70, that's enough. There is something strange about reaching 72. You stop asking whether you won. You start asking whether you lived honestly. The story doesn't replay in my head the way it used to. I don't wake up thinking about audit logs or midnight signatures. I don't picture David's face when he realized the conflict review would move forward. What stays with me isn't the confrontation, it's the moment I decided not to ignore the discomfort. That decision changed everything. Last winter, Linda and I were cleaning out old boxes in the garage. We found the original binder that held our earliest estate documents, the first trust we signed in our 40s. We sat on the floor flipping through it. So simple, she said. It was, I agreed. Because we didn't have much. And because we didn't fear losing it. She looked at me carefully. When did we start fearing loss more than valuing each other? I didn't answer right away, because the answer wasn't a date, it was gradual. As the business grew, as the accounts expanded, as retirement approached, as identity shifted, fear creeps quietly into structure, and structure, when driven by fear, becomes rigid. Rigid things crack. She closed the binder. I wish I had talked to you sooner, she said softly. I wish I had invited you sooner, I replied. We didn't dwell on regret. Regret is heavy, and at 72 you carry enough. Already, instead, we redesigned again. Not the trust this time, our daily rhythm. We began doing something small but deliberate, monthly financial reviews together. Not because I distrusted her. Not because she demanded control, but because shared visibility prevents silent insecurity. Transparency isn't romantic, it's preventative. A year later, I received another unexpected call. It wasn't from a client, it was from David. His voice was older. Less polished. I won't take much of your time, he said. You already did, I replied evenly. A pause. I wanted to say. I miscalculated. That's one word for it. I underestimated you. Yes. Another silence, and I overestimated myself. That was the most honest thing he'd ever said. Why are you calling? I asked. I'm rebuilding, he said. Smaller practice. Different state. I've been thinking about how I blurred lines. Professional lines. All of them. I didn't feel anger, I didn't feel forgiveness either, just distance. You built leverage where trust was assumed, I said. Yes. That's not sophistication. That's cowardice. He didn't argue. I know. The call ended shortly after. I didn't tell Linda about it immediately, not because I was hiding it, because it didn't carry weight anymore. That's how you know something has healed, when the architect no longer controls the memory. A few weeks later, Linda asked me something simple. If I had left back then, who would you be now? I thought about it honestly. Still me, I said, stronger. Clearer. She nodded. And if I had stayed without telling you the truth? That would have destroyed us slower. That's the real danger, not explosive betrayal, slow erosion. Years have a way of compressing lessons into simple truths. Here's mine. The worst part of what happened wasn't the affair, it wasn't the legal maneuvering, it was the quiet belief that I wouldn't notice, that I preferred comfort over clarity, that I would sign what was placed in front of me without reading between the lines. They both believed that, and they were wrong. At 72, I don't obsess over structure. But I don't ignore it either. I don't monitor Linda, but I don't drift into assumption. I don't fear loss, but I respect vulnerability. My wife and my lawyer betrayed me together, but they didn't defeat me. They revealed the part of me that had grown complacent, and once that part was exposed, I never let it sleep again. That's the final layer, not vengeance, not triumph, not even reconciliation. Just a man who stayed awake, and stayed present, until the end.